This is can open source open minds, lessons learned making games about diversity for the IncLudo project. My name's Jesse. And before I begin, I'd like to apologize. This is not a tech talk, so if you're expecting a tech talk, thank you. So there's some supporters too. Anyway, but I am going to tell you about stuff that I find really fascinating, stuff that I've been learning when I've been making games about diversity, and I hope that you find it interesting too. Okay, so like I was saying, my name's Jesse. I work at the CRE Game Lab. So the CRE's Center for Research and Interdisciplinarity, sorry, it's hard to say, in Paris. And at the Game Lab, we make open games for science, social change, and for education. So we create games. Usually we team up with researchers and teachers, and we create games with them. We teach game design, and in particular we have a really cool summer school that we call Glass, where we mix science students and game design students over the summer in order to have them make science games together. So we've been running that for a few years. It's pretty fun. And finally, we do some community events. So we have this club called the Gamedier that Pedro was talking about earlier, where people come and they give talks about game design, about educational games, and all sorts of stuff related to that. Most of the talks are online on YouTube. Some are in French, some are in English. It should be pretty clear when you find them. So if you're interested, don't hesitate to check out that YouTube channel. All right. So this project began when these two guys, these two brothers, Hilmi and Subi, who started a small startup in social entrepreneurship in India, approached the CRE and said that they wanted to make games with us that promote diversity and inclusion in the workplace in India. So, I said, hey, that's a great idea. I mean, I don't know anything about diversity or inclusion, and I've never been to India. But, let's do it, right? How hard could it possibly be? And so it turns out that diversity is very dangerous, okay? And this is true. Studies showed that it can cause discomfort, create rougher interactions, create a lack of trust, greater perceived interpersonal conflict, lower communication, have less cohesion in a group, and more concern about being disrespected. So why are we trying to do games about diversity again? What's the point? Well, it turns out that diversity is also very advantageous for organizations. Obviously, it also is advantageous for a society as a whole, but I won't even argue that point. Just for organizations to be diverse actually brings them a great advantage. And there's all sorts of studies that have shown this. It's really interesting. There's stuff that diversity brings. So the most obvious thing is that, okay, you're a diverse group. You have people of different viewpoints that come, right? That makes sense. But what's really interesting is that the dynamics of the group changes when you have people from different backgrounds. So people actually share information better than they would. Perhaps because if you're with someone who you think is very similar to you, you might not think that you really have to talk about something because it's obvious they already know it, right? But if you don't trust that they really know what you're talking about, then you're going to put it out. And if you think that somebody has a different viewpoint than you, you actually do a better job arguing your viewpoint, which means you do more research, you back up your thinking, you think about what you're going to say before you say it. Whereas if you're with people who, you generally all agree, you don't do that. You just get lazy and you just say what you want to say, And on the flip side of that, too, people with differing opinions or dissenting opinions are actually more likely to bring them up in a group that's diverse. So once again, if you're in a group that with everyone else that's pretty much like you, you generally try to stick with that like you part, and you won't bring up the, oh, this might not work, kind of viewpoint, which can be very important. All right. It is shown in the corporate world to lead for better performance. Companies make more money when they have, in particular, it's been studied with having females on corporate boards, for example. And in the scientific world, it turns out that scientific papers written by groups of authors that are diverse are cited more and have higher impact factors, which is another kind of cool element. And there's a third reason I think that probably big companies have started to care about this, which is to avoid really bad PR. I don't know who remembers this thing with Google Photos when it rolled out, was it 2 years ago? And it was misidentifying people as gorillas. And obviously, right, no one thinks like Google's out to do that, right? That's not what they're trying to do, but it does indicate, well, how come they didn't pick that up, right? And we don't really know, but we can suspect that the reason they didn't notice it before it rolled out is maybe the people testing and doing the QA were not of that background, didn't have that skin color, weren't from that part of the world. And maybe there's a reason that they also to have diversity. Okay, so so diversity is so good. Let's do it. What's the problem, right? And in fact, I think most people would agree with that point. Most people would agree with that point. In the current political climate, maybe not everyone would agree with that point. But I think a lot of people would think, well, we've moved on, right? Like, we know diversity is good. We know people are different than us. It doesn't mean that they're inferior. So, okay, it's good. The problem is that that's not actually, even if we think that way, that's not the way we're really thinking. Because it turns out that, as the quote goes, we are not feeling beings who think, we are feeling beings who think, not thinking beings who feel. Which means primarily we're driven by emotions, and our thinking can be all kind of wacky afterwards. And in fact, even the fact that we make decisions and our reasons behind the decisions may largely be thought up after the fact. That's been studied too. So people will tend to make decisions, and then you justify why you said that, right? So you make decision first, explain later. So that obviously doesn't lead to making really good decisions where you're taking in all the information. And in fact, there are researchers who suggest that our ability to reason did not come from, is not motivated to make really good decisions, but rather to convince other people to join us, if what we want to do, which is really crazy, which means that basically, once again, we're making a decision, then we're justifying it, and then we're going to explain it really well so that other people can agree with us. So that's kind of scary. And in particular, it leads to all sorts of bias. So there's different kinds of bias. Probably the main one that we talk about is called confirmation bias. So that's what they talk about a lot nowadays involving the news. It means that when you get new information and it agrees with what you've already thought, then you tend to accept it as true. If you get information that goes against what you already thought, you tend to disregard it. And if people confront you with information that goes against what you think, often, rather than changing your mind, you will probably double down on what you believe and think that there's some kind of plot to try to get you to change your mind. And in terms of stereotypes, this comes down to people, right? So, categorizing people based on their skin, their age, how tall they are, how pretty they are, whatever kind of thing, and make some kind of judgment about the way they're going to act. And in fact, this is, interesting little side note, it's even been studied that when we see people who we consider very inferior to ourselves, the part of our brains that light up is not the part having to do with people, but rather the part having to do with objects, which means we are capable of literally seeing people as objects. Yes, it's true.
No, I just disagree. I'm a
really?
Public statement. You cannot make such a straightforward assumption, I find.
Well, this is, I'm based on this paper is what I'm talking about.
Yeah, but I don't care about whatever paper. Parts of brains are not significant in the way we see people. Sorry.
Okay. I don't know. That's what I've understood so far. Now, obviously, the two things can go hand in hand. You can have bias against groups of people. Okay. So it actually makes sense why we act this way, right? Our brains have evolved for a certain reason. We don't know for sure, but most likely it's because we need to make decisions quickly, especially in a more kind of wild situation where there's predators, there's different groups of people. Maybe there were reasons to be scared of other groups of people, and it made sense to try to run away or something like that. Okay. So get back to the workplace. In the workplace, obviously, if you want a diverse workplace, well, you have to hire diverse people. Okay, and some of the interesting studies they've done have involved sending out CVs. So someone they'll put out resumes that are exactly identical, except for the name on the top. So in this particular study, they had one person was named, one fake resume was for John and one fake resume was for Jennifer. They sent these out at university laboratories to be hired by faculty members, right? And in this case, it turns out that Jennifer, 10 minutes, okay. Jennifer was judged less competent, would not be hired as often, and if they were hired, wouldn't be paid as much. So that's kind of scary too. Okay, and if you think that hiring based on CVs is bad, well, it turns out that interviews are much worse. In fact, some people suggest that interviews are probably the worst way to hire people because it's when you have the most bias, because you're communicating with them, you come down, you talk about stuff that you enjoy in common, and you're not judging them based on what they need to be doing. Okay, just a quick side note, really interesting example they've done is for orchestras. So it used to be in the US, there were very few females in orchestras. I think it said in 1970 it was less than 5%. And the way they got around this is doing these blind, what do you call it when you're getting hired? Can't think of the name. Blind recitals. So people would come, they put up a curtain and they play behind the curtain. And it actually, at some point, in some orchestras, they made people take off their shoes because there was a thing people could hear when it was a woman walking and when it was a man walking. It's crazy. Okay, so let's go on to games. So when we started this project, making games to promote diversity, we started with the assumption that most of ideas were not going to be very good and that we needed to. Our conclusion is that we need to try a lot. So basically, we structured our project so that we started with prototypes, a bunch, then we cut them down to just 4. That's what we're doing now. And we're going to be developing them for the next year and then putting them out there. All our projects, well, it's open source, otherwise it wouldn't be here. We're going to put out all our data as open data, so all the analytics we get back. And the process itself is open. We're trying to put it all on our blog so people can reproduce our ideas, try different things that we didn't do, etc. Okay, so we started with game jams and with working with the organizations that we're going to be at. And this was, I was going to go through all the different ideas that we tried, but I'm not going to have time. So we tried abstract platformers, online comic captions, 5-minute debates about celebrities, automatic stereotype generators, a whole lot of different stuff. And we put all these things out there. We had our testers in India try them and rank them based on how engaging they thought they were and how much they learned. And based on that, we picked these 4 games. So one of them is, let's see, so Hired is a game where you, we kind of teach about bias. So we give people biases, and you have to hire someone. And so you pick up cards, and everyone's trying to hide their bias, because if someone else finds out, they're out of the game. And so you come up with these really funny arguments where you're kind of trying not to say why you don't want to hire women, because so you have to come up with funny things. It works out pretty well. Pin My State is a game about learning about different regions of India. It's too hard for me, but for people who live there, they can play it. This is kind of a weird physical game where you pretend to be pirates that all have different physical handicaps, and you have to play a cooperative game. And Another Day is a visual novel that we're creating now about you being an HR manager at a... Oh, sorry, I lost the microphone. 1 second. All right, so we don't have a lot of time, but I just wanted to say a few things that we learned with this process so far. So one thing is that we've learned to favor concrete ideas over abstract ones. Once again, based on the assumption that the abstract things, people might agree in the abstract about diversity, but might not act that way in a concrete decision-making process. We found that getting people to talk is really valuable, and that for that, board games actually surprisingly good. So when we started this, we were going to make only video games, and then it turns out most people wanted board games. You can play them. Well, they also work well for a company. Like, you bring everyone in to a meeting room, you put a board game on a table, people can start to play, and then, or a card game, or other kind of tabletop game. People, can start to discuss, oh, this happened to me, this happened to my aunt. You can start discussing things that way. We also found that, in general, people really do like to find out about each other, and they also like to share things about themselves. It's just that, it's a little scary, and you're worried about being judged. And so by putting them in a game context where they feel comfortable, you can make that process a lot easier. All right, in terms of the process, we found that game jams are really fantastic as a way to start. Come up with lots of different ideas and try a lot of things out. We found that using paper prototypes are really great too. So even for video games, to not just code something, but to do stuff on paper and try to make a board game that would act like the final video game is a great process, because it's really quick and you can change the rules. You can change the rules like 10 times in an hour, and you don't have to which you could never do with well, maybe if you're an incredible coder, you could. On the flip side, that's hard for other people to accept. Sometimes if you have a paper prototype, people don't take you seriously. So that's, it's a little harder that way. Okay. And having a diverse team obviously also makes a big difference. This seems very obvious, but actually when we were starting the project, we were mostly guys, and none of us were from India. So we thought, oh, it's so cool, we're going to work with the Indian partner, it won't be a problem, they'll teach us stuff, but there's stuff that's hard to learn all on your own. And so as we started hiring more people who were Indian, who were women, it made things a lot easier. So in conclusion, diversity and inclusion are good things for organizations, and that over time our bias has moved from something that is just out there, some overt thing, into some implicit thing that's within ourselves that is harder to address for that reason, because people don't think that they're biased. None of us think that we're biased. We all think that we're very rational. Games have been shown to help people tackle difficult subjects. And we found that icebreaker and tabletop games are really great for getting people to start to discuss. And finally, with prototyping is a great way to start any process like that. So to get back to the original question about can games really improve diversity and inclusion in the workplace, my answer is you have to wait, and hopefully I'll tell you next year. Okay, thank you very much. And I think we have time for questions, so it's good. I rushed a little bit because I don't.
8 minutes.
Oh, that's all right. Plenty of time. Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
So I was really interested in the game you mentioned about having to hide your bias.
Oh, okay.
So how does it actually work?
Okay. So the way it works is that you pretend that you're all management at a company, and that you have to hire somebody for a position, okay? And then, so it's a random, right now it's cards, and then we're going to move it to a mobile game. But right now it's a cards, and so you see the people with a fake CV, and then everyone has a secret bias card. So for example, mine maybe is like, I don't want to hire a woman. Maybe someone else, I don't want to hire, I don't know, Muslims or something like that. And then what you do is you argue about who you should hire. And you don't want to hire the person that your bias is about. But if it's really obvious, and I'm like, yeah, I don't know, she's going to go on parental leave at some point, well, then they'll know that that's my bias, and so they can call me out, etc. And you try to get the, so you're trying to fight for it, but without really letting it in.
It's really interesting idea.
It's kind of cool. Well, the discussions that come out are really funny, because it's really, yes?
I'm curious about the recruitment process. Who were the people coming? How did they come there? Why? And how many?
For the game jams, or in India, or in
game
gen?
jams,
Oh, yeah. So okay. So it's two very different things. So let me just go back to this slide real quick. That we're talking about. Oh, sorry. I'm supposed to repeat the questions, and I forgot myself. So the question was about the recruitment process for the different events. So when we were in India, we basically did board game making events with the different groups that ZMQ, who is our Indian partner, is in touch with. So there's companies, there's nonprofit organizations, and there's also government parts of the government. So these are basically contacts of theirs that were interested in promoting diversity in their workplace. And in Paris, what we've done is more kind of used our Gamadier community of people who are interested in making games, maybe don't know so much about diversity, although that's not totally true. There are people who really do, and kind of get them to say, okay, let's make games for over the weekend, and and
How many people were involved?
okay, well, for the game, oh shoot, how many? I think for the Paris one, it was around 50 people or something like that, I would say, 40 to 50. Yeah. Yeah, and then, but in India, we've done smaller things. We've done it also at school with a bunch of students. And, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
How do you measure the impact of the game?
Okay, so the question is, how do you measure the impact? So that's really hard. It's really hard because there's a few different things. You could try to measure the impact of the game in terms of what people learned. And that is difficult in itself. You have to have a lot of very specialized standard questionnaires. And the other attempt is to try to see what the organizations actually do in real life. So that's what ZMQ is planning on doing. So there basically is the idea to see if the management makes any changes in their procedures. So, because I didn't talk about that, but there's a lot of things that organizations can do to try to promote diversity in the workplace. It's not just talk about how good diversity it is. There's like very concrete things, like that you can do. So you can make the hiring process more open. You can make people have to write down everything they want about a candidate before looking at the CVs, and that way you can argue it. Actually, if you're interested in that, there's a really fantastic talk by an HR researcher at Google called something bias, diversity at Google or something like that. And it's really fantastic. And he goes through all these different hiring practices that they've done at Google to make it better. So for example, on the interview thing, they basically are trying to get rid of a typical interview where you would just kind of talk to the person and ask them questions, and they've replaced it with like a script. So like, this is the first question, and then the answers are this, this, or this, and these ones are good and these ones are bad. Now, next question, and the answers are this, this, and this. Which is, it's kind of strange because it feels very robotic. It's like, well, we're replacing people with, an algorithm. But at the same time, it does get rid of the bias, right? Because it's something is standardized, and it's not about that. Yes, maybe I'll go to him first since you've already asked a question, if that's okay.
Except maybe the questions and answers are biased because they're written by people.
Ah, yes, that's possible. That is possible. Sorry, you had another question, right? Okay, sorry.
Sorry, but not describe again a particular game because I want to know what's the part of cooperation and competition in your game, because competition, I think, is over in our society. It means us to collective destruction. Another example of a competitive game by excellence is Monopoly, and there are now more and more cooperation games made
That's
by
true.
NGO, and so some peace movement and so on. What's your
All right, so, okay. Yeah, so the question was about competitive versus cooperative games.
Yes.
So in this, okay, so just a quick thing about competition and cooperation. What's cool is that both things can go nicely together. Like, typically in team games, there's a cooperation between the people on the team, and there's a competitive thing between the teams, right? And that's an element where you can mix it. I wouldn't agree that competition is bad, like, by itself, because I feel like it is something that motivates us, and as long as it's within a game context where we understand we're in a game, we're competing in the game, and when we get out of the game, we're not competing in the same way. I think it's acceptable. In this particular games, sorry, let me just skip to the ones that I picked. Yeah, Hired is competitive. Pirate Partage, this one is non-competitive right now, but when we tried it in India, they kept saying, we want a scoring system. We want to be able to know if we're better than the other ones. So we're thinking about making it competitive just to kind of add people. So have people play in a team, but once again, have the teams compete, How many cards did you get through, that kind of thing. This is a visual novel. You just play on your own, so it's not competitive. And Pin My State, you could play it competitively if you wanted, but you don't have to. It's more like an icebreaker. So maybe time for one more question. Yeah.
I just wanted to respond to that in another way. To me, diversity is fundamental of life. I mean, if you don't have diversity, you have death, right? It's just a natural process that applies to quite many social processes. So I'm curious why you promote diversity as a competitive behavior, because you promote it in the workplace as a competitive asset, whereas on the contrary, I think it's pretty much the competition that kills diversity. So I find there's a bit of a contradiction.
Yes, so there was an observation about how diversity is something that can create cooperation, if I understand correctly. And why are we trying to promote competitivity, which is why are we trying to promote diversity as something that's competitive, as an advantage? I guess the reason that if you're trying to bring diversity into an existing social structure made of companies that are competing, then it makes sense to sell it to them as a competitive thing. I guess that's the answer. It's more like utilitarian than anything else. If you were in a different social structure where you could people be much more collaborative, then I think it would be wonderful. I don't know, but I think it would be a different society altogether. It's good. All right, maybe we should stop there. Well, thank you very much.